uh, the message, and as we proclaim the message, we use the words, for those who exalt themselves will be humble, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And within that, we talked about discerning God's presence at work in the world and what that means. It's my pleasure tonight really to introduce a colleague to you who works with our young students at Capital University. He actually preceded Pastor Wendy. Pastor Wendy did an interim there while they were in the call process, and then immediately following that, Pastor Tucker became the chaplain and the pastor there. Unbeknownst to him at the time, that call would quickly change and develop into more than he ever expected, as he is also the pastor and chaplain of Trinity Lutheran Seminary. So he works in both capacities. He's been working with our young students for, I think it's about 6 years now? 5 years. He's preached here once before. He brings a wealth of expertise in discernment and understanding vocation. He has just written a book that he'll talk to you a little more about as we enter this phase of discerning those next phases of what God's calling our community to do. Please join with me in welcoming Drew Tucker.
Well, thank you, Pastor Craig. Yes, I had the good fortune of following Pastor Wendy as she completed an interim, and before her, Pastor Shelley, who is now serving up at United Protestant Campus Ministries in Cleveland, both of whom are very organized people compared to my skill set anyway. And so I just have to say it was really great to follow in their witness and to be a part of that work with them. I'm so grateful to be with y'all tonight. I am blessed to be kind of ending a whirlwind weekend of different kind of life celebrations. On Friday morning, I presided at the wedding of one of our alumni who, when I met her, was in Nationwide Children's Hospital preparing for what we would come to find out was an incurable disease unless she had a bone marrow transplant as a 19-year-old. And she did. And it took, and now she's married, which is so great. And then yesterday, I got to be the part of another wedding of another alum who is a Capital graduate and now a third, going into her fourth year seminary student at Trinity, and got to be a part of her marriage to her teenage sweetheart, who has been a part of her life as she has grown in this new era. And so being here now with y'all tonight as you discern what your future is going to look like, as you explore what it's going to look like, fortunately, I don't think you're looking for a marriage. Like, you've got that part figured out. Pastor Craig, Pastor Wendy, they're here. You all seem pretty stable. That's great news. But then it becomes the question of, what are we looking for? And how are we looking for it? For my background, just a little bit, I am a graduate of Ashland University up north of here, about an hour. I then went to Duke University's Divinity School, where I learned to say soda rather than pop, even though I'm from Northeast Ohio originally. I got my Master of Divinity there. I began my campus ministry career as well there, serving as the campus minister for Duke Lutherans. I then did my Lutheran year of study at Lutheran Theological Southern Seminary of Lenoir-Rhyne University in their second year of being united with Lenoir-Rhyne, one of the first ELCA seminaries to rejoin an ELCA university, which, as I'm sure you're aware, no conflict in those things whatsoever. It's all very simple, and there was no anxiety about that. Of course, there was a lot going on when I was a student, and unfortunately what I found out as I was at Trinity and Capital a number of years later, we really don't learn very well from our pasts, but we are all making progress together, and it's working well. After that, I served as a pastor for about 3.5 years in southwestern Virginia. So I was in the Appalachian Mountains serving Christ Lutheran Church. I was blessed to be their pastor as well as serve as a campus minister at Virginia Tech and Radford University. And so I've had this kind of campus ministry bug working with young adults, 18-ish through 25-ish, although, grad students come in all kinds of age types. And so I've really had grad students who are 20, 30, 40 years my senior and still had the role as being their chaplain or pastor, which is an interesting dance to do. But fortunately, being a congregational pastor, I'd done the same thing there, so that was a gift. But I bring all of that before you to say this. I've got a lot of background with young adults. And so I imagine one of the potential concerns is, we're not young adults. This is not a congregation of young adults. This is not a campus ministry. This is not a university setting. I get that. I really, really get that. I bring that up because I want to be honest that some of this has relevance and resonance with youth and young adults. In fact, I'm teaching a course on youth and young adults with our seminarians this semester. But it also reverberates throughout our lifetimes. Some of what we're going to talk about tonight, I think, can really set us up to have healthier career changes, to have healthier relationships with one another, to have maybe even healthier approaches to our citizenship and our lives as congregations. But that begins with reflecting on who we're called to be and what we're called to do. So, with the next slide, why are you here? I imagine you're asking something like that question. Well, because I wrote this book, right? I wrote a book. I told you I wasn't walking over here, but I am because the books are over here. I apologize. I'm walking right back. I lied about the camera. So, my book is called 4D Formation, Exploring Vocation in Community. So I wrote this. It was published almost 3 weeks ago. This is my pandemic baby. I've got no children. I've got 2 dogs that are treated much like children. This is the closest thing I've ever produced to a child because I gave over a year of my life to it. Didn't hurt nearly the way that giving birth does. I'm very well aware of that. So if you've given birth, don't hear me challenging that. It's your struggle, not mine. But this is something that is a labor of love for me. I got the chance to, in the midst of the pandemic, with all of the grief and trauma and struggle that it was, sit down and reflect on what I've learned in that decade of campus ministry and how it can be applied more broadly. And so, you already see there, discover, discern, develop, decide. You figured out what 4D formation is. That's pretty much all you need. You can leave now. That's the end. That's just kidding. Of course, there's more to it than that, but that's the core of, in my sense, or in my understanding, exploring your vocation. You discover your opportunities. You discern your priorities. You develop your skills and experiences. Then you decide what your next faithful step is going to be. Sounds very simple, but as we all know, it's much more complicated than that. So what I would actually like to do is turn that question on y'all and ask, why are you here? So why did you show up? If you just showed up for the food and the party, that's fine. Shout that out. But it was that sausage dip that was up there, ooh, that's where it was at. That was wonderful. So why are you here? Why did you want to be a part of this conversation? Okay. That is exactly the kind of honesty we need tonight, right? Absolutely. We want to hear what an author has to say about their own stuff, but we also want to support our leaders who we just celebrated 10 years of their leadership and not embarrass them by having nobody show up. Pastor Wendy, having done campus ministry, knows that that's a real fear for those of us that play an event, so that's great. Thank you for that. Who else? Why are you here?
I was thinking of post-pandemic, and I read your book, and so I wanted to meet the author as well. But also, as people are coming back or not coming back to church, the faces, there are some returning familiar ones, and there are new ones, and I have returned, and I would like to be able to discern what part I'm to be in this next phase of the life of all shepherds.
Right. So there's a lot there, right? We are in this kind of watershed moment as a society where the pandemic is still happening, but it's a different phase, it's a different season, and so we're more open, we're more regular. Whatever normal was, it won't be that again, but we're developing our new normal. And so in our role as members of All Shepherds, what is our part going to be in that? So the personal discernment, but then also that communal discernment that you're doing as a congregation, as you're embarking on this process of planning, of strategizing for what comes next. So you each play a part in that, and then also you play a collective part in that. Great. Well, thank you all for sharing. And if you decide later that you want to shout out why you're here too, that's also absolutely fine. You can just interrupt me. I do my best to receive that well. So next slide, if you will. Here, when we was talking to Pastor Craig and Pastor Wendy about what we were doing tonight, what we wanted to accomplish, why ask me to come in and talk? Because I love to talk about stuff, but I like to have some kind of purpose. It was around these two things: fostering a listening presence for God's call. So one of the things that I want to accomplish tonight is doing my best through the lens of my book to help you imagine or envision what it's like for you as individuals and as a church to foster a listening presence for God's call, and then to develop a shared understanding of vocation that will lay the groundwork for your specific strategic planning process. So here's the thing. I use the language, a shared understanding of vocation, very intentionally, because I'm going to give you my definition of vocation. It ultimately doesn't have to be yours, all right? This is one way to think about it. There's a whole conversation amongst authors about how we should think about and define vocation. But what I want to do is give you a framework that you can start from. I often talk about this when we're talking about being a Lutheran college at Capitol, because not everyone's Lutheran, and not everyone wants to be a Lutheran the way that I talk about being a Lutheran. And ultimately, that's fine, as long as what we're talking about is how we are a Lutheran university. So if what you're ultimately talking about is how you are enacting your vocation, how you are living out your holy purposes, then that to me is success on the other end of this. So let's then think about, with all that in mind, on our next slide, how we use 7 minutes well. What is the best way that you can use 7 minutes in your life? Sometimes it's a nap. Amen. Praise be. Yes. Focus on a task at hand, right? Pray. I promise I didn't cede Pastor Wendy's response there. I asked the question because neuroscientist Andrew Newberg, who is a doctor, began about 20 years ago looking into the neuroscience of prayer and meditation, trying to figure out what's going on in your brain when you are at prayer. So they did brain scans of Catholic nuns and of Buddhist monks and of Protestant pastors and of laity from all different walks of life, including people who weren't religious at all. So these are people with different belief sets, different understandings, and what they found was, if anyone, has a regular prayer practice or meditation practice for at least 7 minutes every single day, it begins to rewire the way that your brain fires within 6 weeks. Within 6 weeks, by spending just 7 minutes of focusing on the task at hand in prayer, the way that the energy works in our bodies resets itself. I've got to tell y'all, I read this when I was at a time as a pastor at Christ Lutheran in Radford. I'd been there for about a year and a half. I got there were 14 people in worship, including my wife and I the first day. And I'm trying to figure out, how do we do this thing? Is this really worth it? Where is God at? What is God up to? I was questioning, is this really who I think God is? Is God even here? So, just your normal first call pastor having an existential crisis and wondering if he still believes in God, and then picks up a neuroscience book like we all do. And so I read this book by Newberg called How God Changes Your Brain. And in that, if you'll take us to the next slide, he shows a number of these brain scans. A baseline scan before prayer and meditation begins, and then afterwards, what happens in the prayer scan. And so this is a quote from Newberg. When they looked at the brains of Franciscan nuns in prayer, we found increased activity in the frontal lobes, but also increased activity in the inferior parietal lobe, which is the language area. I promise you, I know next to nothing about brain lobes, so I'm really trusting the neuroscientist here. But the latter finding makes sense in relation to the nuns doing a verbally based prayer practice rather than a visualization meditation. In other words, what does all that mean? Just the simple process of meditation is going to pull energy into the front of your brain, into your frontal lobes. Why does that matter? Because this is the part of our brain that makes us Homo sapiens sapiens. This is the part of our brain that is newest, that effectively led to things like the Industrial Revolution. And it also leads to things like compassion and empathy. So 7 minutes a day in bringing the energy to the front of your brain doesn't just increase your ability to do things like complex math. That actually still hasn't worked for me. I'm terrible at math. I need physicists in my life. I can't do that work. But it helps us to be more attentive to the environment around us. Because if we're more compassionate and we're more empathetic, that means that we're more aware of not just ourselves, but ourselves in relation to our environments and our communities. So here's the fascinating thing about all of that. Do you remember what your amygdala is in your brain? What is that control? What is that otherwise known as? What's that? Escape, that's right. Snake brain. It is your reptilian brain. Fight or flight, exactly. So this pulls energy not just toward empathy, but away from those fear-based responses. Now, let's be clear, the amygdala did some really wonderful things in our development as creatures. It helped us to escape predators, to develop societies. These are good things. But if what we're trying to do is foster a listening presence for God, if we're trying to be attentive to what God is up to, we don't want our energy in the fight or flight realm. We want our energy in that compassion, in that empathetic realm. So here's the good news. This is available to everyone. What Newberg notes here specifically for Christians and Franciscan nuns in this case is that when we pray, we use language, unlike how some Buddhists, for instance, might pray in a deep meditative state that is not dominated by language. And so that little language center is not going to fire for those meditators in the way that it will for us as we, for instance, undertake the Eastern Orthodox Holy God, holy and mighty, holy and immortal, Lord have mercy. Holy God, holy and mighty, holy and immortal, Lord have mercy. Holy God, holy and mighty, holy and immortal, Lord have mercy. Because as our compassion, as our empathy begins to fire, so too will our language center as we are focusing on language. So I don't know much of anything else about neuroscience, but if you're interested, andrewnewberg.com is his website. These images are directly from there. He has a number of books out there, including How God Changes Your Brain, and I highly recommend it. Because for me, as someone who at the time was wondering about who God was and what God was up to, it was so important to remember that there was something in this body that could still make a difference. And here's the great news. I'm still a pastor that believes in God, so we got through it. We're doing great, right? But the reality was, it began as I meditated, as I prayed, and I stopped living in fear of failure with a 14-person congregation. And I started living in compassion for a community that had been abandoned by manufacturing and coal and politics and economics. And that's when I realized God was there the whole time. I just wasn't living in the way that I was going to notice what God was up to. So, with all of that in mind, we're actually going to dive into a practice. Because I'm not the one who just likes to talk at you all the time. I actually want to put these things into a little bit of practice, at least a couple of these. So one of the first things I would suggest is if you're going to foster a listening sense for God, you've got to prioritize your prayer lives. And that's not just me coming at you saying, you must pray. The reality is, you've seen the science. That if you want your energy in your brain to be at the place where you're going to be most attentive for what God's up to, setting time aside in that intentionality is going to be key in that. So we're not going to do 7 minutes, but I do want to lead us in a short meditation practice just to give you a sense of what's possible. So I'm going to invite you to take a seat that is comfortable for you, however you are comfortable in your chair. I'm not going to tell you how to sit, just however you're sitting, be attentive. And you can keep your eyes open. If you're going to do that, I would say focus on something in this beautiful sanctuary that draws your attention, a cross or a candle or a font, maybe one of the pyramids. Or you can shut your eyes if that's going to be a helpful way to keep your focus. And I invite you to take a deep breath in through your nose and let it out through your mouth. Like Adam having that first breath from God in through your nose and out through your mouth. One more time, in and out. Just take a moment to notice how your body feels in this space. Start with your feet, in your shoes or on the floor. Maybe your legs are crossed and you feel pressure in a spot. What is your body telling you? Go up through your legs to your hips and your torso. Are you relaxed? Are you tense? Are you full from that wonderful meal? Are you thirsty? What is your body telling you? Go through your arms, up your back, into your shoulders and neck. Are you tired from a long day and looking to rest your head? Are you enlivened by a celebration of 10 years of ministry together? What is your body telling you? Then through your chin and your cheekbones and your jaw, your eyebrows, your cheeks, your forehead to the top of your head. Do you feel at rest? Do you feel exhausted? Do you feel concerned? What is your body telling you? Now I invite you to turn your attention away from your body and to our environment. What do you hear? What do you feel? What do you smell? What do you taste? What is your environment telling you? And now take your attention from your environment and put it on God, the God who called us together in this place, the God who became human in Jesus, the God whose Spirit still blows through this place. Think back through to what your body was telling you. And think back through to what your environment was telling you. And then ask yourself, what is it that God is telling you through your body or through your environment? What is it that Jesus has for you in this body and in this place? Where is the Holy Spirit calling this body to act as a part of this community? I invite you to take a deep breath in through your nose and out through your mouth. In through your nose and out through your mouth. One last time, in and out. And when you've completed your practice, I invite you to turn your attention back to the front of the room. Anybody fall asleep? I've fallen asleep during meditation. There's no judgment here. I want to be clear about that. How many of y'all thought about 7 minutes of prayer and that felt like way too long or way out of reach? That was 7 minutes. I told you we weren't going to do 7 minutes, but yeah, I lied to you. But it's because I didn't want you to expect it was going to be that long. 7 minutes, when it's focused on the thing that's at hand, can go by just like that. What I invite you to think about is that this practice, not this practice specifically, but your prayer practice as a Christian in this space, can be the first sign of your individual attentiveness to what God is up to in the next steps of this congregation, and finding ways to do this together, fostering this kind of listening presence with one another, can really open you to learn from your environment in ways that you may not have otherwise heard before. So for instance, before we began, I knew there was commotion out there. And then in the midst of our meditation, I became very grateful for the people that were cleaning up so we could be here in this space at this task. Sometimes that prayer practice can turn our awareness into thankfulness, or our awareness into attentiveness. So on the next slide, you'll see something that I want to turn to now, given our time. So if we are fostering this kind of awareness for God, this kind of presence for who God is and what God's up to, we've got to ask, all right, well, then what's God going to be telling us? What is it that God is going to have to say? Maybe God told you something through your body or through your environment. Here's one of the things that culture often tells us, our setting often tells us. Hey, if you are a firefighter, that is your identity. Or if you are a teacher, that is your identity. Or if you are a parent, that is your identity. Or if you are ... There's a deep danger in assuming our identity is our work or our vocation. How many of y'all, and I'm not presuming here, have gone through a career change or a retirement and maybe felt a little bit lost because you had identified yourself as the thing you did rather than as the person you were, beloved by God? Can't tell you how many students I work with who are just devastated when they realize econ is going to kill them, or so they are convinced. And so they can't be a business major. But they've always dreamed of being a business major because their parents were business majors and they were going to run the family business. And so changing majors meant they were losing their identity. There is a danger in presuming our work is our identity because that's not how God created us. Remember, God created Adam and Eve before they ever worked. Before they did a darn thing, they were beloved by God with beauty and purpose. But their value didn't depend on their accomplishments. It didn't depend on their wealth. I tell my students all the time, you are not your GPA. I would tell many of y'all, you are not your performance reviews. We have to remember that our identities are not equal to our vocations. We live so much of our life in this middle area where the overlap happens that we can get confused and maybe even convinced that it is, in fact, that thing. Just think about the language, the verb to be. I am a pastor. I am a straight white male. Vocation, identity. Use the same verb to describe both of them. So I've tried to begin not saying I am a pastor, but I serve as the university pastor at Capital University. I work as a professor in a classroom. I write because I am separate from the writing. I am the one who does the teaching, but I am not only a teacher. And so we have to find a way to begin to not pull these apart, but recognize the differences. Because here's what I would say. All Shepherds is a community that is beloved by God, regardless of what decisions you make in your strategic plan. Your identity will inspire that. Your identity will shape that. It will inform what you can do, what you're called to do even, but it is not the same thing. And so being clear on the front end that you're already beloved by God, that you are already embraced as loved children, and then from that you get to go and do fun, good work, that's where we want to end up. So on the next slide, I have one way that I have liked talking about this. Identity is the core of your being. Identity is the core of your being. Personality is how you express your identity. So is anyone out there sarcastic like me? Just me? Really? What? Thank you for joining me in my honesty here. Yes, my wife puts up with my sarcasm all the time, as do most of my students and colleagues, so that's great. By the way, thank you all for continuing to put up with my sarcasm. But vocation is how you put your identity to work. So I, in my identities, don't have to be a pastor. I didn't have to get married. I don't have to vote. But in those areas, I put my identity to work in specific ways. Another simple way to frame this is identity is who you are and vocation is what you do. Identity is who you are and vocation is what you do. One of the examples that I give in my book is that there will come a time when my parents are no longer living on this earth. So while I will remain in identity as a part of that family, my vocation as their son will change. On the happy end, I'll never have to teach them how to use their iPhone ever again. But on the sad end, I won't get to play golf with my dad or reminisce with my mom about Grandpa Jake, who was the preacher before I was the preacher in the family. The reality is the way that we live our lives, the way that we put our identities into work will change over time. And so if we put all of our eggs in the basket of being a son or of being a citizen or of being a husband or a teacher or a firefighter or whatever, when that changes, we'll feel like we've lost ourselves, even when God is still holding us and saying, no, you are my beloved. I love you so. It's just time for a different kind of work. I imagine that's something like where All Shepherds is. You've gone through years of ministry. We've gone through this pandemic together. And this pandemic has probably revealed some things that, that's not what we're going to do anymore. Or maybe it's going to have to be a hard look at things that we love and we need to set aside. Maybe it's going to be like giving up teaching on the iPhone and you're going to be glad to toss it into the river, right? Who knows what it is. But there will be some things in this process that you will lay aside. And there will be a sense of loss and grief with that that's appropriate. But you're not losing your identity when you give up your work. You're simply saying, I'm going to put my identity to work in a different way. And that can come in new and wondrous and exciting ways. So I said I was going to give you a definition of vocation. I gave you a couple of ways to think about it, and we've already gestured to it a couple of different ways. How I talk about vocation is any meaningful, life-giving work you do for others or you do for the world. Any meaningful and life-giving work that you do for others. So that could be making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich for students as they are hanging out after school one day in the lobby. That could be mulching your neighbor's flower bed. That could be like my dad being he was known in Wayne County as the butcher because, you guessed it, no, he wasn't a criminal, y'all. He actually was a butcher. My grandfather started a meatpacking plant in 1960, and so my cousin still to this day runs the family meatpacking plant. That was meaningful, life-giving work for my dad because he loved to know that he was helping people be fed, that he was helping people have good, locally raised, healthy food that empowered their families to survive and hopefully thrive. That was great. That's great work. It's just not my work. My dad was wonderful and never tried to force me into that work. But that's because he knew this distinction better than he ever really could say. Because he knew that I could go to work as a pastor, or I thought I was going to be a lawyer for like a day and a half. Well, we have law students we care for at the university. God bless them. And the bar exam, that's not what I'm called to. Thank the Lord and sing God's praise. But instead, I was called to this work. But tomorrow, maybe my career as a pastor ends. Maybe I never write another book. Maybe I never teach another class. I'm still beloved by God in the midst of those things. And it's because we do work that is life-giving and meaningful for others that we can take hold of that. Because it's not just meaningful for me. I could do work that's meaningful for me and it meets no one else's needs whatsoever, right? It's really meaningful for me to smoke brisket. I love to smoke brisket. It is a deeply spiritual thing for me to smoke a brisket and then consume a brisket. I want to be clear about that. I don't just smoke it and set it aside. But if I'm not doing that and then sharing it with others, then it's not vocational work because I am not giving life with it. I'm not sharing beyond myself. So as you dive into this strategic planning process, I encourage you to think about what work would be meaningful for y'all, would really connect with your sense of priorities, connect with your sense of values, your purposes, and also would meet needs in this community around us. We're going to burn through a few examples because we started a little late and I'm going a little long, so I'll own slightly more than half of the fault. So I really appreciate, when we were looking at the slides, I was asked, so this image shows up like 4 times. Is that on purpose? Because usually that means someone forgot to do what they're supposed to do. It's actually on purpose. Can anyone tell me what this image is all about? I know someone can tell us what the image is all about. I'm not saying that there's someone in here that read the book already. I'm just saying that someone in here has read the book already, and I don't play favorites. But, so what's this about?
So the boxes are the 4 Ds.
Right.
And it's, what's the word? It's what's the word? I mean, it goes on and on.
That's right.
And it goes into each other. And
So, it's the kind of thing, do you now see that there's a D on the right side and then a D reversed on the left, there's a D above and there's a D below. So, this is a never-ending process and it's not a linear process. So, as we discover, discern, and develop and decide, every discovery is going to lead to new discernment. And every decision is going to lead to new developments. And every development's going to lead to new discoveries, and so on and so forth. So you can't just discover one thing and then discern one thing and then develop one thing and then decide one thing, because that's not how human life works. Blame God for that one. It's not my fault. It's just the way it is. But the beauty of it is, in our meditations, I bet you discovered something. Maybe something your body was telling you, or a noise you hadn't noticed in here before. But I also would bet that you began to then evaluate its priority. That you began to discern what meaning it had and what level of value it had at that moment in time. So just in that short little process, not only did we pull a little bit of energy to the front of our brains, not only did we connect with our God, but we also had this little taste of what it means to discover some things that can also lead us to discernment or development or decisions. So next, I am going to suggest, we're not going to, just time-wise, we're not going to do this because I want to talk about a few other practices that might be helpful for y'all. But instead, I'm going to send Pastor Craig and Pastor Wendy the resource that I got community mapping from, which is from the Appalachian Folk School from my time down in southwestern Virginia. So they encourage you to take a little piece of paper just like this, and a marker or a pencil or whatever you want to do, and to have everyone in the room draw in their community where are the places of authority and where are the places of influence. Now, you might be inspired to ask a number of questions. How do we define our community? How big? Where? What do you mean by authority or influence? Here's the answer. That's not my job to tell you. It's yours as you draw the community that you envision All Shepherds is called to serve. So maybe it's a 3-block radius from this point on 23, or maybe it's all of Central Ohio and more. And then to put the places of power, the places of influence, the places of authority on there, so you can begin to envision where are we drawing life and influence from in positive or negative ways. So for instance, we did this at Capital University, which, as you might know, is in Bexley, Ohio. 43209 is one of the wealthiest zip codes in the country. And then with Whitehall and East Columbus on either side of us, which are not nearly as affluent, we had a number of different people draw where are the places of authority or influence or value. People who had cars never drew bus stops. But some people drew bus stops because that was how they got around. People with bank accounts didn't actually draw banks because most of them did all of it online. People who needed to cash their checks either drew banks or credit unions or check cashing places. So how you, as a community, think about your community, your mission field, will influence your strategic planning. Because you'll begin to imagine, oh, we need to connect with these people or with this place or this community partner. But that may not be a shared vision of what really matters in your community. You need to suss out who is at play and who you want to be engaged with. So the next one is that is a discernment practice, right? You're discerning the value, the priority of your individual sense of community, but then putting it in a conversation with others. One of my favorite things that we did with this at Capitol once we did this process was we looked at the places that overlapped on our community maps, and then we wrote thank you notes to them. So some of that was places of power that were people, right? To our president's office, which was very nice. But some of it was just places. So one was it's not a quad, it's a Schaff lawn. Thank you. I knew I was going to get there for a minute. It's the lawn between our student union and one of our residence halls where all of our first year events were held that particular year. So that was a place where people had met their friends. Their community had taken root in that place. Though we never had events there, that was where these students had really found their value. So we wrote a thank you note to Schaff Lawn. I didn't quite know how to deliver that other than to lay it there and say thank you and then put it in the recycling bin, but it was still meaningful, right? But you can do this kind of work. Then you can use priority matrices. How many of y'all in your corporate lives or other kinds of ways have used a priority matrix before? Anyone? I see a couple of heads nodding. So my publisher, when I began sharing the origins of the priority matrix, called me out and said, this doesn't sound like a real story. So I had to do a little more research and found out it was in fact true. That the urgency and importance matrix that I like to use actually does come from President Eisenhower giving a speech to the World Council of Churches. And President Eisenhower said, this is me very much paraphrasing, not quoting 100%, every day I have to deal with things that come across my desk. Some of them are urgent, some of them are important, and almost never are the two the same thing. So for instance, if because of your life you don't have to file taxes until April 15th, and you're spending time doing that in October when your family from out of town is visiting, it's a very important thing that's not at all urgent. So why are you doing that? That's an easy one that we often make, a decision that we wouldn't do because it just doesn't make any sense. But in your strategic planning process, there will be a lot of things that are important. There's going to be more work for this community than you can do as a congregation. I promise you that. So you're going to have to do the hard work of identifying, of discerning, what are the specific things that you are called to? What are your vocations in this next arena? But here's the wonderful thing about that, and this is the hardest thing for me. I think Don knows this, at least intuitively. I like to do everything all the time. I like to meet needs. But if I try to meet all of the needs, you know what I don't do? Leave room for you to do your vocation, and leave room for you to do your vocation, and leave room for you to do your vocation. Not the least of which is I don't sleep and I get very grumpy. Right, yes. The reality is, to find our callings and to discern what is truly most urgent and important for us will mean that we let other people fill those areas that are urgent and important for them. It's where we become a community that relies on one another rather than assuming that all shepherds is going to save the earth, because guess what? It's not. And surely Drew is not going to save the earth either, because that's Jesus' job. But God's chosen to do it through all shepherds, and through All Saints in Worthington, and through Capital, and through Trinity, and through Wittenberg, and through Augustana, and through Duke, and through all of these different people at play together. I would assume, because I believe all things are possible in God, that even our political parties can play a role in that at this point. I don't know, but I'm just going to believe God's more powerful than I imagine is true. So the priority matrix, which I'll also send along, it's really simple. It's an XY axis, urgency on one end, value or importance or priority on the other. And so something might be very urgent and very unimportant. Guess what? I would suggest you leave that behind, that you don't need to worry about that. Because if it's really urgent but it's not important, then why are you worried about it in the first place? But if it's very important but not at all urgent, that's what God made checklists for, right? The reality is we can focus on those things with a long-term view rather than making them the focus of our everyday life. The next slide. So we go from discovery and discernment and then into development. So with development, what I want to think about that is you're developing your skills or your experiences. So for instance, I had this grand idea at one point that I was going to hike down a canyon but not use a path. That was a dumb idea, dear friends. It was a really bad idea. But you see, what we had done, I was on this trip in college. A bunch of us went and hiked 27 miles in the Gila National Wilderness, which was great. And then we got lost because, well, we found some big cat. We're going to call it scat because we're in polite company, right? It's pretty fresh scat. And so we were not really wanting to be eaten that day. So we got off the path, right? We were just like, we're going to flee, and then we'll find our way back to it closer to the canyon rim. But we lost the trail. So we wandered for hours. This is my first time hiking alone. This is my first time, or hiking without adults around. It was just college students. And so I'm like, all right, y'all, we're at the canyon rim. We don't know where the path is. We can see the river. We can definitely scurry down these first 30 feet or so. It's the next 175 feet that I really don't know, but I bet we'll be fine. Thank God for Sam, because Sam had been hiking before, and Sam was also not dehydrated like I was. And Sam said, Drew, we're at the canyon rim. We know the path runs on the canyon rim. We can just keep hiking back north until we get to that path. Sam had an experience of development that I didn't have. Sam had developed through his routine of hiking. He'd hiked like 30, 20-plus mile hikes. in wildernesses across the country. And so Sam knew what he was doing, and he was willing to speak into my life that was not yet developed. There's a better way to do this. So there's another number of ways you can use development practices. The one I will suggest for y'all is this, on the next slide. So how many have y'all do council retreats, or do y'all do confirmation retreats, or you do mission trips, or you do things away, right? Gamifying the classroom is really kind of a popular thing in education right now, where you try to basically make teaching fun and fool the kids into learning, right? My teachers did this. It didn't have a fun name at that point. It was just we played catch in my 5th grade classroom with a tennis ball, and it was whoever answered the question quickest got to have the tennis ball and then ask another question of another student, and so you got to try to stump your friends, right? It was great. But we all learned the data for the test that way because Mr. Anderson knew that if we were all engaged in watching the ball and listening to the questions, that we'd pay more attention. It was great. So what I'd suggest is in your work, as you continue to go down the path, you can gamify your retreats. In other words, so let's say you've decided there are potentially 3 options for you at All Shepherds. Spend a long weekend or a week at family camp actually trying them out on a very small scale. Put them into play as though that is the future you're going to live. Because then, as you begin to live it out in the first time, you might realize this sounded a lot cooler than it feels right now. That doesn't mean we're not called to it, but we have some more development to do. We have some more skill building to do. We need different resources than we currently have. Or on the flip side, one of the best things about this is people who don't think they are called to this, in the midst of the game, light up. And all of a sudden they realize this vision that they might not have caught before, they're now on fire because they're living it out on a Saturday at a church camp when it can become their everyday at All Shepherds. So if you game this work, if you give it that kind of fun, I imagine it will give you a chance to really work well together. And then lastly, decision making. This is the one where I'm going to tell you someone wrote a book that's better than mine, which, by the way, my publisher has told me never to say, but here we are. There's a book out there that is actually for community discernment called Another Way. It comes out of the Forum for Theological Exploration in Atlanta. It's by Matthew S. Williams, Dory Baker, and I always forget the third author's name. I use this book in my congregational ministry class every single year because it gives you a nice format for how to do the hard discernment work as a congregation or a group together. And the way they talk about decision making is taking your next most faithful step. And I got to tell you, I love this language, taking your next most faithful step. Because how many of y'all have had a simple decision that's been in front of you and you found yourself all of a sudden frozen because you couldn't make it? So you just asked that simple, most holy of question of, what would you like to do for dinner tonight? And then we just can't decide, right? Like, we're going to have KFC, we're going to have churches, are we going to have Popeyes? We're gonna have it's all just chicken. Get the chicken, man. I don't care where you get it, right? But the reality is we treat most decisions as though they are eternal, when in fact they are just one faithful step ahead of us. So that would be my last recommendation for y'all on this next slide, which is as you come to decision points, have what's called a Clearness Committee of community members. Anyone read Parker Palmer, A Hidden Wholeness? If you haven't, it's a kind of classic vocation book from 20-ish years ago. Parker Palmer is a kind of giant in the vocation world. And he's a Quaker. And Quakers have this thing called a Clearness Committee where they're going to make a big decision about life. And the story Palmer tells is he was invited to be a college president. So he invited about 6 close friends around him. And they're tasked not with telling him what to do, but asking him deep questions. So they kept asking these questions. And he just didn't have good answers. He didn't have answers that satisfied him. So finally, one of his friends asked him very bluntly, well, Parker, what do you imagine you would like about being a college president? And Parker said, I think I'd like being called Mr. President. And that was about it. So it was clear through this Clearness Committee that though it seemed like a great opportunity, it was not what he was called to, because he wasn't called to it for the work. He was called to it for the fame or the ego. But what I would suggest for y'all is that you would gather not members of this community, but you go back to that community mapping exercise, and you look at the places of influence, the places that you wanted to make an impact on or be in community with, and you present them your plans, your vision, your goals, your mission, who you hope to be, and you invite them to ask you hard questions. How is All Shepherds going to do this work? Where is this going to be evident in the life of our community? Because that, though really vulnerable, is where the fruit of this work will be born. Because if vocation is any meaningful and life-giving work you do for the world, then when people are asking you those questions, if you've done that hard work, you will have some initial answers, or at least some thoughts, some possibilities. And if you don't, that's still good discernment, right? That sends you back. Again, this is not a linear process. It pushes you back into the, all right, we have more discovery or discernment or development to do before we finalize this thing. So a Clearness Committee is something that I have used in a number of decisions in my own life, and I would invite you to use it as a community as well, because that will invite not just, we think this was a great idea, but what is God saying through our community? Just like that meditation, what is God saying through our environment and our bodies? What is God saying through the different people that we've identified as priority partners in this community? So that's a lot. That's a whole lot. I'm going to share some resources with Pastor Craig and Pastor Wendy, but we are 12 minutes past when we were initially supposed to be done, and I know y'all been here for a long time. So I just want to say a couple of things. One, thank you so much for spending a little time with me tonight. Two, Dawn told me earlier, because y'all are great, there are about 20 copies of the book over here for y'all, so if you don't have a copy and you would like one, they are available for the taking over in this Amazon box, including that one that I hid back here. That is not my copy, that is yours. So I'm going to put this one back where it belongs. So if you would like a copy of the book at the end, you're welcome to take one from over here. And then lastly, I would love to stay in conversation with y'all if there are things that I can be helpful for, not just in terms of your strategic planning process, but more in terms of your own life. If there's ways that I can be helpful, if there's resources you're looking for, I'm glad to be a reference or a support in that process. Before we end, do y'all have any questions or anything you'd like to say? Would you like to tell me where I'm wrong? It's the best invitation I can give. Great. Well, thank you all for hanging out tonight. We appreciate it. Blessings on your journey, and happy anniversary to Pastor Craig and Pastor Wendy.